She has demonstrated an incredible track record of producing important, high-quality work published in some of the most important journals. She was named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 in Sports in 1996. And it's my belief that not only in a very short time will she be one of the leaders in empirical bioethics research, but she's going to be a leader in her field related to head injury in sports and so on. So the topic of her talk is injuries in college athletics, individual, institutional, and ethical considerations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Christine Baugh to the University of Colorado.
Wow, that's loud. I just want to thank Eric for that grand introduction. Maybe it was a little bit too grand. I was 9 years old in 1996, so I definitely was not on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list that year, but just points of clarification. I'm really excited to be here, in part because the Boston weather is horrific, and in part because I'm really excited about this opportunity. So without further ado, let's get going. A bit of a roadmap about what I'm going to chat about today. I'm going to give you a little bit of background, although Eric did a whole bunch of it, about myself and my research. And then I'm going to talk about two specific research studies that provide two examples of the different kinds of methods I've taken to address empirical work that has ethical implications within the realm of sports injury. So that's me in a nutshell. I did my undergrad at Harvard, where I was an athlete, and have been really interested in understanding more about injury in athletics since I was there. Suffered some injuries myself, engaged with the athletic trainers who, for those of you who are involved in healthcare and medicine but perhaps don't know, tend to be the front lines of healthcare delivery in terms of sports medicine on college campuses, on high school campuses. I then moved to Boston University, where I worked with a group that studied the long-term effects of concussion and traumatic brain injury from sport, specifically the disease chronic traumatic encephalopathy. I took a step back and started thinking about this from the public health perspective when I did my master's, and then the policy perspective in my PhD. So those are sort of my priors, and I think it's important for any of us as scientists, as researchers, to understand what experiences have informed your perspective on your work. And so those are mine. And my work has transformed over time, just like I have. So beginning with the work at Boston University, thinking about the neuropathological classification of disease, to a more behavioral framework, to a more policy framework in today's present work. So the first research study, without any more ado, this study evaluates the relationship between how colleges staff their sports medicine departments and the injury rates and other injury characteristics in those college athletes. So the NCAA is the largest overseeing body for college athletics. In the NCAA specifically, there's about 460,000 athletes participating in a range of sports, but there's many more athletes across other areas within college athletics, community colleges, et cetera. This is far over 500,000 participants. There are about 1,100 schools who are NCAA affiliated schools. And the NCAA itself was founded as an organization whose mission was to protect the health and well-being of student athletes. So there is a regulatory function to the NCAA. There are no rules, however, under this big regulatory umbrella about how colleges go about providing healthcare to their athletes. How many clinicians they must have? Is there a minimum acceptable standard of care? And so in my degree in health policy, we start to think about healthcare delivery and healthcare quality. And one of the frameworks that comes to be informative in this context is the Donabedian model of healthcare quality, where we think about the relationship between structural features in the environment, for example, how many doctors there are, as well as process features. What do those doctors do? Do they use best practices? Do they use the checklist they're supposed to? And then the ultimate outcomes of interest. In the context of sports injury work, the context of athletic medicine in the college campus, this framework hasn't really been applied. So I wanted to investigate this relationship between the structural features in the college athletic medicine setting, specifically the number of healthcare providers on campus and injury outcomes in that college's athletes. This was motivated by an experience that I had when I was conducting a survey-based research study. And I went to one of the schools that was participating, and there was one athletic trainer for that entire school's worth of athletes. There were many hundreds of athletes on this campus. They had a Division I football program, and they had only one athletic trainer who, relayed to me how frustrating this was for him. He was unable to provide the level of care he wanted to for his athletes. When he traveled with the football team, the rest of the athletes had no access to an athletic trainer. And so I filed this away in my mental Rolodex as something that's worthy of studying. Is this an anomaly, or is this a symptom of a broader trend that we just don't know about? With obvious ethical implications if it is, right? So the research questions that I was aiming to answer in this paper was, is there variation in how colleges staff their sports medicine departments? That's the question of, is this an anomaly or is this a bigger trend? And then if there is sufficient variation, what is that, or how does that relate to the rates of injury and other injury characteristics in those colleges' athletes? Fortunately, there's a lot of data sources. Unfortunately, they're disparate sources, right? So I combine data from a number of different places in order to try to answer this question. The Daedalus Center for Sports Injury Research and Prevention runs what's called the NCAA Injury Surveillance Program. While it has its flaws, it is the largest injury surveillance program of college athletics. And so I was able to obtain that data, including the number of injuries, other injury characteristics, and importantly, the denominator, the number of times an athlete was exposed to an activity where they may or may not experience an injury. I also got the information from the NCAA, who has this but doesn't regulate, about the number of clinicians and number of athletes on a given campus. This was from the NCAA research themselves. And then from Department of Education Title IX disclosures, I was able to get some information about the athletics revenues and other institutional characteristics about the schools. So what did the data kind of look like? We had over 12,000 athletes who participated in over 25 sports, over 140 schools, a whole lot of games and practices from not evenly distributed, but a wide range of sports, male and female. Those 12,000-ish athletes experienced 25,000 injuries. About 2,500 of those were classified clinically by the clinician who entered the injury into the electronic health record as a re-injury, something that happened again. About 1,500 of those were concussion. And about half of those injuries, just over half, were what's called non-time loss injuries. These are injuries that are relatively minor. Athletes are able to continue participating in games or practices while they have sustained this injury. So an ankle sprain is a typical example of this. You get diagnosed with the ankle sprain, you get taped up, but you're able to continue to participate. The average number of clinicians across campus vary pretty widely. So the minimum number of clinicians, this is any healthcare provider, athletic trainer, sports medicine physician, other allied healthcare provider on a college campus, was 1. And the maximum within the sample of folks that we had, those 141 schools that participated in the NCAA Injury Surveillance Program, was 16. It was not a normally distributed group. A lot more people were in the lower part of that distribution. So the median number of healthcare providers on a given campus was 3. So we had a lot more schools that had a small number of providers compared to a larger number of providers. The number of athletes also ranged significantly. So we had some schools with relatively small athletics programs, about 71 athletes on that campus, versus other schools that had very large athletics programs, almost 1,000 athletes on the campus. Again, not totally normally distributed, but this one isn't quite as skewed towards the smaller side of the distribution. So as you can imagine, if we're thinking about this ratio between providers and athletes, and there's quite a range in both of those values, we might have quite a range in what that ratio looks like. So at the school where there was the, quote, best staffing ratio, the clinician had the fewest number of athletes to care for, that clinician saw 29 athletes, so a patient load or a caseload about 29. The school with the worst staffing ratio, the greatest number of patients per clinician, there was 575 athletes that one clinician cared for, with the median school being about 106. So without any further investigation, it doesn't take too much to maybe come to the conclusion that it's pretty impossible for a clinician who's caring for 575 patients to provide the same level of care as a clinician who's caring for 100 or 29. But fortunately, we have the data to kind of back this up. So what we did was investigate 4 different injury outcomes from the injury surveillance program data set that we had. So total injury rate. We also investigated re-injury rate, the time lost to injury, so how, as a measure of severity or clinical conservativeness in management, and then the rate of concussions. So this was a Poisson regression. We used the offset of the athletic exposures as the denominator to make the injury count into a rate. There's a couple of other technical notes. It's a zero-inflated Poisson regression because we had some zero heavy distributions for the concussion and the re-injuries. I can talk more about the technical details if anybody's interested later, but what we found was that there was a very significant relationship between the way colleges staff their sports medicine departments and all of those measures. So colleges where there was 1 standard deviation greater number clinicians per athlete, we found a reduction in overall injuries of about 10%, 9.5%. And that translates to about 2,400 fewer injuries in our sample. Similarly, we saw a reduction in re-injury rates. We included this specifically because the literature suggests that clinical management has a very clear relationship to re-injuries. So we saw this as kind of reinforcing the relationship between that initial injury finding that we had and clarifying that this might be closer to causal with the number of staff clinicians that were present. So we saw a reduction in re-injuries as well. Reduction in concussions, which is a specific interest of mine, 6.7 fewer concussions at the schools where there were a greater number of medical providers on staff compared to the athletes. That would have saved about 100 brain injuries in the cohort that we were studying. And we actually saw more time loss. So about 16% greater time loss in the schools where there were more clinicians present to provide healthcare. Quick recap, so the association between the clinicians and athletes and injury outcomes suggests that when there are a greater number of clinicians per athlete, we find fewer injuries, fewer re-injuries, fewer concussions, and greater time loss. Now this is an association study, but we always kind of want to be thinking about what possible mechanisms are. We think those first 3 might be related to injury prevention practices. Sports medicine clinicians, specifically athletic trainers, engage with other stakeholders on the campus to not only treat injuries, but also to put in place practices to prevent injuries. Mobility training, they coordinate with sports, the strength and conditioning staff to do specific exercises for a given sports team, for example. Better management of the initial injury might be related to the reduction in re-injuries, and it might just be a signal of greater sort of priority for health on a given campus. So it may be that institutions where they prioritize having more clinicians on campus end up also doing other things to promote athlete health and wellness. The greater time loss we see specifically as possibly a more conservative injury management practice. It's pretty hard to hold an athlete out if you're not able to provide them with any care or management plan. So one possible reason why we see greater time loss where there are more clinicians is that there's more hands on deck to actually do something for that athlete when they're injured. This obviously has big implications for the athletes, but it also has serious implications for the healthcare professionals. So there's a whole literature to suggest, both within athletic medicine, but also across medicine more broadly, that the responsibilities you have in your job are very related to your job satisfaction and work-life balance, burnout, etc. So in this context, we've seen in other studies that understaffing, not feeling like you have sufficient support to do your job is very much related to all of these factors in the clinician's life, as well as their ability to implement policies like a concussion management policy in a very robust way on their campus. Obviously, there are limitations to this study. There are limitations to all studies, right? And it's important to acknowledge those. We had a pretty coarse measure of staffing. We had total count of healthcare providers. This did not delineate between all of the different types of healthcare providers and their training, et cetera. This is an association study. It's a snippet in time, 5 years worth of athlete injuries, and correlation does not mean causation, but it does give us a sense that in this pretty large group of athletes, pretty large group of injuries, reasonable size number of schools, we see a meaningful association between the way schools choose to staff their sports medicine departments and the health outcomes in their athletes. We wanted to know more about the generalizability of the schools that contribute data to the NCAA injury surveillance program. Fortunately, that Department of Education data allowed us to look at that. Unfortunately, what we found is those schools differ meaningfully from schools that don't participate. So the schools who contribute information to the NCAA injury surveillance program on average are larger, they're more well-funded, they tend to skew towards Division I, they tend to have more athletes, and they tend to have better staffing ratios than we see at the other institutions. So while it doesn't generalize, it actually raises some more red flags about those institutions who don't contribute and have worse staffing ratios as to the health outcomes of their athletes. Implications are important, right? We talked about the health implications for athletes. We talked about the implications for job satisfaction, work-life balance, burnout for these clinicians. This would have saved about 3,000 injuries in 1 year if it was extrapolated to the broader NCAA population without accounting for the difference in staffing, the larger number of athletes, et cetera. The NCAA has the ability to regulate this. They have the ability to regulate all kinds of things in college athletics. It is a member-driven organization, so regulating is non-trivial, but my hope is with a white paper and a peer-reviewed publication that comes out soon, they'll have to start thinking about this pretty seriously, because it should not be the case that an athlete who goes to participate in women's soccer at one school has a drastically different probability of injury than an athlete who participates in the same sport at another school just because of the way that school chooses to provide healthcare to those athletes. I'm going to pause there. We're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about another study. I want to get through them because I know a couple people have to leave early and I want to leave some time for questions at the end. So switching gears, new study. Do college football players accurately estimate their risk of injury? Quick poll. Who thinks college football players accurately estimate the risk of injury? There's going to be no surprises to this study, and yet it's still pretty important to know the empirical answer, right? Because one of the pillars of the modern debate around whether or not we should allow participation in football is this idea of informed decision-making, right? Adults, maybe adolescents, maybe parents of youth, maybe not, depends on who you talk to, right? Should be allowed to make a decision about whether or not to participate in a risky activity, such as football, insofar as they're informed about the risks, right? So let's ask the question, are they informed about the risks? Risk estimation has been shown in a number of domains, including health-related risk behaviors, to be associated with whether or not the individual chooses to take that risk, right? So your personal estimation of how risky it is to go walk across the ice may inform whether or not you actually choose to walk across the ice or take some other path to get to your vehicle. You can also imagine in a world where there is some known or defined risk profile. Some people might overestimate their risk, some people might underestimate their risk, some people might be perfect estimators. Then in the context of college football athletes, we have no sense, right, up until this study about whether or not they're any good at estimating their personal risk of injury, which may be important for an informed participation in this, what we know to be dangerous game, right? So what we did was we, after doing some qualitative work to inform the design of a sample survey, we conducted a sample survey. We came up with a beautiful sampling and recruitment plan, right? Stratified, random, cluster sampling. We took into account the divisions of competition. We were looking at the 5 most competitive conferences within the NCAA. They're called the Power 5. They are involved in all of the bowl games people watch in January. And I say this mostly for the students in the room. It didn't work. But that's okay, right? You can still learn from things, even if things don't go exactly as planned. So what we ended up with was 4 football teams out of the 65 who were asked to participate, 265 athletes in 3 of the 5 conferences that we targeted. To the extent that it matters, 2 of those teams had winning records, 2 of those teams had losing records. You know, One of the schools was private, 3 were public. It was actually a little bit of a spread in terms of geography and other things. Not to say that it's representative, but it wasn't quite as bad as you might imagine it could be. So we asked them questions about how many times they suspect that they had had a concussion, both in the past year and over their previous football career. And then we asked them those same questions about injury. What we found was that in the last football season, about 34% of those athletes had a suspected concussion. Pretty high. There was 156 total concussions in that sample, so some had had more than one during that time. 76% said that they had had at least one suspected injury. We defined injury as a bodily harm that required medical attention. What we wanted to do was to use what they said about their past injuries to create a risk profile for what their single season risk of injury would be. So we took all of the data combined. We used predictors that the literature suggests modify risk of injury, position, profile of whether you're a starter or a bench warmer or somewhere in between, etc. And we modeled their individual probability of an injury, single season, or individual probability of concussion. So did you have an injury? Yes, no. Modifiers to then predict their single season risk of injury. We did the same thing for concussion specifically. What we found was that there's a wide distribution of modeled risks centered around somewhere close to what we found to be the single season risk of injury from their past. So that's a good check from yourself, for myself, about whether or not this model is doing something reasonable. And then we had also asked them the questions, how likely do you think you are to get an injury or a concussion next season? And those distributions, we have concussion on the right and injury on the left. We have predicted and self-report, top and bottom respectively. What do you make of those, right? So we see the concussion risk, maybe the distribution looks kind of similar, but we're asking this on a Likert scale. What do you do? We have the future injury risk. The distributions look pretty different, right? The bottom one, the self-predicted, is pretty skewed left compared to the other one. So how do we get this Likert scale into a probability scale to make a meaningful comparison between what we think their 1 year risk of injury, 1 season risk of injury is, to what they think or they predict their future risk of injury is? Fortunately, there's a whole body of research that gives you information about what people tend to mean when they answer questions on a Likert scale. So the first way that we tried to do this mapping was to use those values, those distributions, and apply them to the values that the athletes suggested when they said very likely or unlikely to get an injury. The second way we did it was in part a check on ourselves, and in part to give the athletes the most benefit of the doubt as possible. So what we did was we took all of their values compared to all of the modeled values. We tried to minimize the gap between all of them, right? So it was a pseudo minimization, trying to bring those things as close together as the data would allow us to go. What did we find? Those two ways of creating probabilities out of Likert scales came up with very different assignments, right? The literature-derived cut points had internally consistent values because they were assigned the same. So no matter if you were answering about injury or concussion, when you said very likely, you meant the same thing, which makes sense. Whereas when we did the data-driven minimization function, those two things were pretty different, which doesn't make so much sense, right? So there's pros and cons to each of these approaches. Individual consistency and an empirical basis as the pros for the literature-derived approach. It is a little bit of an arbitrary assignment, it feels like, and it hasn't been assigned for this specific population, so those are possible cons. The data-driven minimization function gives the athletes as much credit as possible. We're not going to say that they're bad estimators, unless the data just won't let us say anything else. However, it's inconsistent across items, and it can lead to pretty nonsensical assignments, like very unlikely being 70% or something like that, that just doesn't make intuitive sense. So what do those two versions of things tell us? Let's walk through this slowly. So we have the data-driven approach on the left. We have the literature-driven approach on the right. Injury on top, concussion on bottom. Anybody who falls in that bolded diagonal across any of those matrices is a quote-unquote accurate estimator, right? Their model probability and their athlete perception align. Anybody who falls in the top category has a greater model probability of injury than their predicted, self-predicted probability of injury. So they are underestimating their personal risk, anybody who falls in that top triangle. Anybody who falls in the bottom triangle is overestimating their personal risk. So you can see by the sort of heat mapping on there that there are far more people who fall in the either accurate or underestimating across any of those approaches or injury categories than fall in the underestimating side. Specifically, we found, depending on which approach we're looking at, between 51 and 91% of athletes underestimated their risk of injury, and between 60 and 63% of those athletes underestimated their risk of concussion specifically. A lot of assumptions in this project, right? That doesn't mean that we can't learn something from it. And I think that's an important takeaway for any of the students in the room, right? Things don't always go according to plan, but you can still learn something from a variety of research projects. This is athletes in the very most competitive football programs. How that generalizes to other populations, not clear here. This is all males. How does that generalize to females? Not clear here, right? The literature suggests that males tend to be a little bit more risk-taking, a little bit lower risk estimating than females do. There's assumptions in our model. There's assumptions in our mapping of Likert to probability. But when we're thinking about the general question, right, where we started with this project, it's like, do athletes have a reasonable understanding of what their risk of injury looks like going into participation in what we know to be a risky sport? Many more athletes seem to be underestimating their risk than overestimating their risk or accurately estimating their risk. And that's important to know when we're trying to think through how we come up with the concussion education or athletic medicine communication programs to make sure that they have an understanding about what the risks of injury look like, if there are enough athletic medicine providers on campus to give that message, right? These two projects have somewhat of a synergy where we need to make sure we're doing the things to reduce the rates of injury, and we also need to make sure that they have an accurate understanding of what that risk profile really looks like. Before I take questions, I just want to thank the many people who were involved in this research, especially the athletes who filled out the surveys to make that second study possible. I think it's far too often that the participants get overlooked in research, and I never want to do that. So I'm thanking explicitly the athletes who participated in this research study, as well as the sports medicine clinicians who provided data about injury to the injury surveillance program. With that, I'll take any questions you might have. Sorry, the neglected back quadrant. Let's look over here. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, is there a golden proportion, or how many clinicians do you think a specific sport would need, like based off of like if it's football or basketball or baseball?
Yeah, great question. So I think there have been some efforts to provide those kinds of sort of guidelines. Right now, I don't think that they're agreed upon at all. And you bring up the issue that, you know, an athlete who participates in football, for example, has a very different risk profile and perhaps need for healthcare on average than an athlete who participates in swimming or something else, right? And so that's sort of the next line of research, is coming up with what would be a reasonable standard for care. Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Yes, go ahead. Got it. So other research that I've conducted around the area of staffing has suggested that the type of provider, or at least the level of training of the provider, does matter. So we looked at injuries in male ice hockey players, same injury database, with a more granular level of staffing where we had an idea of how many folks were considered intern athletic trainers versus like a staff or a full like attending equivalent athletic trainer. And what we found was that there was different risk profiles for the injuries depending on whether there was a big proportion of the trainees versus a big proportion of the staff. So yes, but that definitely needs to be fleshed out more. And especially when we're thinking about those schools who have one provider at all. I mean, we just need, there's some that just need to be brought up sort of from the bottom, no matter who it is. Like any allied healthcare provider would be better than one for 575. Great question. Yes, Dawn.
A little unfair. I'll follow up from the same question that I asked you back at APHA. Okay. You know that your results regarding concussions are contra to a pretty large number of papers that have been published now. And I hypothesize it's because you combined initial and recurrent concussions. So have you had a chance to go back and look at that? Because you're reporting that concussion rates are actually lower when there's higher staffing. And the vast majority of literature says that it's the opposite, that when you have more medical staffing there, you actually identify more of the concussions that are occurring. Yeah. And that staffing just prevents recurrent concussions because they're better about keeping athletes out of play until they're fully recovered. So have you broken down your concussion analysis by incident versus recurrent concussions yet? And
we've not, but I think one of the other differences between this study and some others in the literature is that at least some of the others in the literature compare any staff person to no staff person rather than the gradation, right? So there may be a very big difference between the number of concussions that are identified when you have anyone there versus no one there than when there is some variety of proportion of providers to patients. But no, it's still on the
It's a great theory, but you won't know until you do that. You need to do that analysis. You need to break down your initial versus your recurrent.
That's why it's not submitted yet. Any other questions? Yes, Dan.
Hey, Christine, that was great. Sort of a similar question, and this is just asking you to speculate, right? But so, because one of the things we know from the epidemiology is that, it's not clear how we would actually prevent mild traumatic brain injury from occurring, especially in a context collision sport, right? So one of my questions is if staffing is actually genuinely associated with a reduction of the risk, so we're actually preventing, what's the mechanism? If it's true, and I know we don't know, but if it's true, just asking you to speculate, how is that happening? What are we doing that's preventing mild traumatic brain injury in a collision sport?
Got it. So a couple of ideas, right? And this is very speculative, not yet supported by any of the data. One would be that the athletic medicine providers are coordinating with the strength and conditioning staff, and there's some shaky evidence to suggest that neck strengthening, for example, might be in some people like at least assisting with concussion prevention. Perhaps a more likely approach, and I'm thinking about this on the fly and speaking in front of the audience as I go, so forgive me if this comes out a little wonky, is that ratio comes from two places, right? Number of staff and number of athletes. So it may actually be just a function of smaller schools and reporting. Remember that all of these information come from diagnosed concussions and traumatic brain injuries when we're talking about this, so in the medical record. So there's a lot of shaky ground that we're standing on because over 50%, some estimates suggest, are unrecognized and unreported, which may be differential across levels of competition. Yes?
Well, this is all new to me, so I'm going to ask perhaps two naive questions. The first one is why you didn't regress against the finances of the organizations in the first study. It seems to me that richer organizations might have very different approaches to injury than poorer ones. Mm-hmm. Second question is about your risk perception study, which is at least in adolescents. It turns out that risk perception is similar to adults. What's different is reward perception. Mm-hmm. They see the risky behavior as having a bigger payoff than adults see it. Yeah. Does that play a role in that?
I'm going to start with the first one. We actually did cross-validation for model selection in that study. So what we landed with in terms of our predictors was based on a cross-validation procedure. And so that basically guards against overfitting of the model, and that's why we didn't include the finances of the school. Great question, though. It's definitely like in the wheelhouse of things we were considering including. The second question is a good one, and I think it gets to like a next step of this study, which is if the perceptions are different than quote unquote reality, to what extent does that actually influence behavior, right? Which is probably what we care about. To what extent does their perception, whether or not aligns with what we think is true or untrue, actually influence whether or not they're doing something? And I don't know, right? I mean, that study didn't answer that question. There's a lot of literature around adolescent risk-taking. There's a lot of literature about males specifically being more risk-taking, right? So we have adolescent young adult males. That's like risk-taking plus risk-taking. We also know that people who participate in an activity and then estimate the risk of that activity tend to underestimate on average. So if I'm, walking down the icy sidewalk, I tend to think that that's less risky than somebody who's witnessing me walking down the icy sidewalk. So there are a lot of things, even before we did any of the estimation, that would point to our outcome, right? But we still had to do the study to confirm that. I think the next step is trying to learn more about whether or not that influences behavior, which is what we're really interested in. Great question. Anybody? Yes, go. This is what I hope to think more about, actually. So knowing that we individuals tend to underestimate our risks of all kinds of things, the so what question is like the policy. And so I think in my next position, that would be something that I'd be really interested in digging into a little bit more, which is, is this for some reason a risk we should consider differently? Or is this just an area where we have so many policy levers available that we should think about at least trying to bring the perceptions up towards reality? I don't know, but I'm really interested to think more deeply about it. Question back here behind me, yeah. Yeah, great question. So the next wave of research, after I address Dawn's question with the staffing, right, is to try to understand whether there's differential effects in the relationship between staffing and injury based on sports. You can imagine sports that have more notoriety or bring in more dollars, like you just mentioned, might get higher priority, so that average measure of staffing is actually weighted more towards giving them greater access and perhaps other athletes lesser access, which if the finding kind of continues to hold, might exacerbate the injury outcomes in certain sports and reduce the injury outcomes in others. But it's a great question that I haven't answered yet. Yes. Yeah, so we did. And again, a lot of work still to do here, right? But we did ask questions about perception of your own risk versus, I think we said, a teammate's risk. And so one of, again, the next steps is we want to sort of aggregate teams' perception of teams' risk and see how that compares to the average personal perception to see if there's some sort of differentiation between what individuals tend to think about themselves versus what the average looks like. Hypothesis being that everybody kind of underestimates their own and maybe more closely estimates the kind of average risk. Great question. Dawn, go ahead.
So a question about the second study, which I hadn't seen before, really nice. We know from previous research that athletes are particularly poor at reporting their own injury history. And you asked for athlete self-report. So first of all, did you compare that to the actual injury reports from the medical providers at the institutions to see how accurate the athlete self-report was? And then second, you didn't give us your response rates for your study, but can you compare the athletes that were starters or frequent players versus the athletes that were bench sitters? Because we know from some other, like some DOD research, that people that are really, really active out in the mix of things all the time tend to underreport their injury history, and the ones that are sitting on the sidelines hoping to get in the game tend to overreport to fit in. So can you compare the bench sitters versus the others, or did you do that yet?
Yeah, so we did, and actually included in the measure of predicted future risk I think it was disaggregated into about 5 different levels of starter all the way down to bench warmer. So that was basically the beta value from that was assigned to each individual based on their status to try to include that in the estimation. And we haven't found anything in particular there, which I think was surprising for me as well. And we have not compared to the individual schools' records. I'm hoping that we'll be able to compare to more averaged records from Daedalus, but that's a DISC application in progress. Well, so the issue is that we were asking about, we have both measures, but what we were looking at is not what they told their athletic trainer they had as their injuries, which we suspect to actually be pretty different than what they kind of know themselves to have been their injuries. Because in their own personal estimation, you would suspect that they're basing it on their known personal risk. So even if we did have the athletic medicine records, I think it would be hard to interpret, basically, because there's this level of reporting the injury to the provider and making it into the record, and then comparing it back to the perception. And there's this missing piece of what gets reported versus not. Eric?
Could you just talk briefly about your plans in terms of extending your work to non-college athletes and also potentially to groups like soldiers and people in general, and kind of where you hope to go in the future?
Sure. What a question. There are a lot of directions that I could possibly go. So obviously soldiers is a very interesting one, especially given the proximity to the U.S. Air Force Academy campus. What we're starting to see is that there's some differences in cadet behavior versus cadet athlete behavior. Many of them do participate in intercollegiate athletics. So that would be an interesting thing to kind of bear out a little bit more. I think the risk-taking, sort of the decision-making around risky behaviors would be something that I would be interested in expanding even beyond sports stuff. So we have many things that we choose to do or not do based on kind of our internal calculus of the risks and rewards, et cetera. And some interesting ones here in the state of Colorado, medical marijuana or non-medical marijuana. Vaping is a pretty hot topic right now that would be really interesting. It's a lot of ways to kind of extend in that direction. I could go on, but I'm going to take another question if that's okay. Yes. You mind using your microphone? I can't hear you.
In the first study that you showed, the percentages for injuries decreased by around 9-point-some%, and the re-injuries decreased by 2-point-some%. How is that like if there's more medical care given to athletes? You would expect the re-injuries percentage to be much higher, I would believe, than injuries, because they're getting more care not to be hurt again. So why is there that big of a difference?
So I think that this is a really good question. What we interpreted this to be is that the re-injury rate also decreasing kind of reinforces the general premise that there's an association between staffing and injury outcomes. It may be the case that based on our sample, based on who's included in the injury surveillance program data, et cetera, that 9.5 is a little high or the 2.6 is a little low, right? So there's that, the generalizability factor. There's also the question of injury reporting. So I didn't get into the details about how this data comes to be, but basically an athlete has to go to a healthcare provider get a diagnosis. The diagnosis makes it into the healthcare record. It then gets de-identified and sent to the injury surveillance program. There's a lot of steps between there. And so those steps might be differentially, I guess, utilized, right? So an athlete who has more or less access may report more or less. So there's kind of that issue that we're not quite able to understand. And then the schools being different sizes, levels of competition, we account for that in our modeling, but it's a little bit hard to know how that bears out as well. So it's a great question. We don't have a really good answer for it yet, but thank you. Yes? Yeah, I guess it depends on who you talk to. So I most frequently interface with the athletic trainers in that context, and they love this, right? Because it says that they're doing something valuable and that they're harping to their athletic director that they need somebody else in their department is, you know, validated by what the research is suggesting, that it would in fact have some meaningful difference on athlete health outcomes. So I think that they're hoping to utilize this as something to kind of support increased staffing, decreased burnout, that sort of thing. I imagine, though I don't know, that the athletic departments themselves might be a little bit nervous about things like this, especially if they fall on the lower staffing side of the spectrum. But I'm kind of okay with them being nervous about it because maybe they'll then do something, right? I mean, I think that that's the ultimate goal of my research platform and many others, is to actually have some meaningful change. And so that would be great for me. Go, Dawn, go.
Where, again, I really like study one. I don't think the last time I saw you present this, you presented table 1. And it brought up a new question. There was a really high number of ice hockey athlete seasons for that small number of schools, which showed the schools that participated were probably a little different than the overall NCAA schools. When you got the dataless data, you did get school-specific data, not just aggregate data, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that you weren't using...
It's still specific. It's all weighted. But it is notable, right? Ice hockey is actually pretty well represented compared to many other sports.
But we know that each school doesn't report for every single sport.
Correct.
So what I'm saying is, for the schools that participated in your study, you only used injury data for the sports that they report.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you all.
All right, Christine. Thank you very much. Everyone, thank Christine for coming today.
I'll be around for a couple minutes if anybody has any questions they didn't want to say over microphone.